It was 1880, and this was a pivotal era in Canadian history. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, had just championed the Canadian Pacific to build a coast-to-coast railway that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail. And in 1882, Canadian Pacific was mapping west of Banff when the young and adventurous Tom Wilson, this guy was guided by the Stony Creek First Nations up a lake to upon which when he arrived he entered in his journal, "With God as my judge, I have never in all my explorations seen such beauty." And Canadian Pacific's visionary Cornelius Van Horn wasted absolutely no time commissioning a cabin on the shores of Lake Louise upon hearing the discovery. So in 1883, the Canadian Pacific would build a fishing shack just on the banks of Lake Louise, but in 1893 it had burnt down, and the following summer in 1894, it would build a bigger, much stronger chalet in its place, dubbed the Chalet Lake Louise. And in 1886, Philip Abbott, who was thought to be one of North America's most experienced alpine climbers, led an expedition to conquer Mount Lefroy. But only feet away from the summit would fall to his death as he hit the frozen lake below, and this was the first recorded mountain climbing death in all of North America. And upon hearing the news, the Canadian Pacific began enlisting Swiss Alp climbing guides in an ambitious expansion to the chalet. A new concrete wing that was a big shift from the style of the original chalet and the rest of the Canadian Pacific hotels across the Rockies. And this wing was built between 1900 and 1912 and welcomed private balconies, which were pretty cutting edge at the time, and helping to further immerse guests in the luxury of the untouched beauty of Lake Louise. Now, Lake Louise is on a pretty steep incline up from the village, and by 1913, guests had been arriving on horse and buggy, which took about 90 minutes each way from the station. But in an attempt to innovate, the Canadian Pacific built a tram line from the station to arrive at the Chateau, as you see here, cutting the commute time to 20 minutes each way. Now, July 3rd of 1924 was a pretty bad day at the Chateau, because around 10 a.m. the entire wooden chalet burst into a flame, and although the staff were very quick to separate the blaze from the concrete wing despite the chalet being burnt to a crisp, this was a pivotal moment because 3 months later, in September of 1924, the Canadian Pacific broke ground on a new 9-story wing expansion, and in June of 1925 emerged a 400-room, new neo-Renaissance style hotel that we now know today as the Chateau Lake Louise. And 1926 actually saw the inception of the Lake Agnes Tea House atop the Big Beehive Trail for hikers looking for a hot cup of tea or joe after their hike, as well as the second largest pool in Canada at the time, which we will absolutely be revisiting a little bit more later on. Now, the Canadian Pacific's daily passenger service east and west into Lake Louise played an integral role growing tourism to the Chateau. But in 1939, the Chateau would close its doors until 1945, following the conclusion of World War II, and after the reopening of the hotel, guests were a lot more conservative with their money, despite the debut of Canadian Pacific's finest fleet in 1955, the Canadian. And the dawn of the 60s saw CP actually discussing selling, or even in some cases demolishing the Chateau altogether. I know it's hard to believe thinking about things now, but back then, this was the state of the Canadian Pacific. But the late 60s and early 70s saw the explosive growth of downhill skiing, and in 1974 the Chateau remained open year-round for the first time. And believe it or not, Lake Louise was actually a huge catalyst to attracting the 1988 Calgary Winter Olympics, and in 1979 the hotel would close for a $65 million renovation and would reopen just in time for the Olympics, with loads of passengers streaking from Calgary at the station just outside the Palliser Hotel, west on the Canadian, into Banff and Lake Louise to experience the glory of the Canadian Rockies and see for themselves why Lake Louise is regarded as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Now, less than 2 years after the conclusion of the Calgary Olympics, in 1990, the Canadian government would cut passenger service from Vancouver through Lake Louise and east into Banff and Calgary in what they described as a quote-unquote way to save Canadians money, despite the billions of tourist dollars that would evaporate overnight, with no tourists being able to experience Canada's crown jewel-filled lake or having access to Lake Louise via the train that built this area for over a century previously. And in 2001, Canadian Pacific bought Fairmont Hotels brand and would begin to rebrand all their hotels as Fairmont, now making the Chateau the Fairmont Chateau Lake Louise.